We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined today by Susan Aitken, who is the leader of the council in Glasgow. Thanks for joining us, Susan.
You're welcome.
Now, we're going to talk a lot about the situation facing asylum seekers and refugees in Glasgow. Before I come on to that, I got my calculator out and I think that you are the longest serving leader of Glasgow Council in its history. I mean, how does that feel?
I don't know about its entire history. I say it in the modern era. So since Glasgow City Council
since
was
the reorganisation,
in the mid-90s, when the reorganisation. Apparently I am, yes. I mean, to be honest, it wasn't by design. It sneaked up on me. Somebody told me. I think actually when Nicola Sturgeon resigned, I thought, I wonder how long I've got to go. And I looked it up and I'm like, oh, I'm already past it. But it's, it's not something I think about day to day. You're just getting on with the job and there's never a dull day in the job. There's always something new to contend with. So yes, it's not been a kind of a guiding factor in the work day to day.
I think you've been in charge now for 7-8 years. How's the city changed and developed since you've led the council?
I mean, it has actually changed significantly in a short period of time. We had COVID, for example, and all cities changed with COVID, and will never be the same again. But Glasgow was hit harder than many others because of the history of depopulation in Glasgow, and particularly the kind of deliberate depopulation of our city centre. We had one of the biggest drops in footfall outside London in the UK, and so we've had to take a completely different approach to thinking, what is our city centre for? Because something like that could happen again. We can't assume that everything just goes back to the way it was. And actually, even before COVID, we already knew that Glasgow City Centre was too concentrated on too few uses, and that it needed to be more diverse, and crucially, it needed to have more people living in it. So that's been a big push to drive that city centre recovery, but do it in a way that isn't just trying to recreate the past, but is trying to build in resilience and sustainability for the future. City centres should have people living in them. They should be neighbourhoods. And conversely, what we saw during lockdown, or as lockdown started to ease and people were able to go back out again, was Glasgow's neighbourhoods absolutely flourished. So I'm in the south side. I'm in Shawlands. Shawlands was going like an absolute fair. So were places like Denniston, like Maryhill, Partick. They did incredibly well. It was at the expense of the city centre, but people have rediscovered their local neighbourhoods. Glasgow is, for a lot of people, Glasgow already is that 15 or 20 minute city. So we need to rethink, how do we get people back into the city centre? How do we make it attractive? How do we make it the jargon in urbanism is sticky, so that people don't just come in, but they spend time there, they stay in for a while. And that needs to be more than just coming into the office and then going home again. But what we're also seeing actually is the expansion of our city centre beyond what folk have thought of as its traditional boundaries, which is actually quite compact, if you think about it. So we're seeing the city centre now naturally extend beyond the river, for example, and out to the east and west, and bits that for a long time were a wee bit, desolate's maybe too strong a word, but there wasn't much reason to go there. We're starting to see them become really vibrant, and in actual fact, where we are now in the Daily Records building, this is an area where we can really see the city centre start to expand out west along Argyll Street, and new uses and new buildings and new homes start to emerge there. And what will come along with that is also hospitality and just generally, city vibrancy is spreading. And that's a good thing. It doesn't happen overnight. It's part of almost a generational process. But actually, we can see it happening really quite rapidly in Glasgow.
So let's just focus on one of the main challenges facing the city just now in terms of the budget. I mean, is Glasgow in crisis over the costs for asylum seekers and refugees in terms of their housing?
So can I just make a distinction first? This is a complex area, and there's a lot of legal and legislative differences. So for asylum seekers, no, because we don't have responsibility for asylum seeker accommodation, haven't done for a very, very long time. That's a Home Office contractor who does that. In Scotland, it's Mears, and they have accommodation, most of which will have been former private rented accommodation. We don't have asylum hotels in Glasgow. We don't have asylum hotels because we've been an asylum dispersal city for over 20 years. So for a long time, that kind of estate, if you like, has been built up by the Home Office contractors. So the asylum seeker accommodation doesn't cost the council, doesn't cost the city anything. When people are given leave to remain, though, and they become refugees, they legally then are no longer asylum seekers, they're refugees. The UK government has said to them, your asylum claim is valid, it is legitimate, you have a right to stay here in the UK, and they get leave to remain status. At that point, they're essentially put out of their Home Office accommodation. They're evicted from, and in some cases, place where they've lived for quite a long time. Now, in the past, that's been a relatively manageable process for us in Glasgow. It's been a pressure, don't get me wrong. It's not been without its difficulties, but it's been a manageable process. The majority of people who become refugees at that point, they do come to the council and register as homeless with us. They become just part of our general homeless population. They don't get any special treatment or different treatment from someone who's become homeless in another way. Somebody who's lived in Glasgow their entire life and has lost their home for, all the many reasons that homelessness can affect people. So they're not treated any differently. They just become part of our homeless population, and we provide the same statutory service for them as we would for anyone else. And in Scotland, that means that we get a roof over your head. Ideally, we get you into permanent accommodation as quickly as possible, but we get a roof over your head and get you into temporary accommodation in the first instance. And that's our duty towards everyone who's homeless in the city, who registers as homeless in the city. What has happened, though, is that the previous UK government a couple of years ago, in order to say that it was reducing the number of asylum seekers, started to mass process the asylum applications and give people leave to remain at a far faster rate than they had been previously. Now, in some ways, that's a really good thing because folk are sitting waiting for these decisions for a long time, sometimes years. But they weren't putting any additional support in place, and they weren't changing that thing of making people homeless and putting them out of their accommodation. So instead of maybe dozens, a manageable numbers of folk throughout the year, we were suddenly getting hundreds of people who had leave to remain in the UK coming to us and saying, I'm homeless, I need somewhere to stay. And essentially, we run out of accommodation. At the same time, there are other pressures. The cost of living crisis is increasing homelessness demand among the general population for obvious reasons. People are struggling, and sometimes their rent falls by the wayside. And the work that we do with our housing association partners and with the homeless charities, the likes of the Simon Community and others working on the ground, the homelessness prevention work that we do is really successful, actually. But you're almost kind of swimming against the tide in some respects because the pressures on people in their household incomes are so difficult. So what we were seeing was a sudden increase in the number of people coming and declaring themselves homeless, and we just weren't able to expand the amount of accommodation available quickly enough to be able to meet that demand. Then at the same time, we've got another pressure, which is that so the statutory duty towards homeless people that I've described is different in Scotland than it is in other parts of the UK, where the statutory duty is more limited. It's primarily to families with children, or to women who are pregnant, or to someone who has a particular vulnerability, perhaps a mental health problem. So local authorities in England are not obliged to provide temporary accommodation for, say, a single man who is fit and healthy. But we are. So at the same time, what we've seen is significant numbers of people who have been given leave to remain as a refugee in other parts of the UK, travelling to Glasgow to declare themselves homeless. So Belfast is a big area, but also London, Manchester, Liverpool, really the big cities and the big kind of centres where there are a lot of refugees in England. We're seeing a steady and increasing number of people coming, a couple of thousand over the past year or so. And again, that's another pressure where the numbers start to go up. So where the cost bit comes in here is that in order to get a roof over someone's head and not leave them sleeping in the street, we have to use hotels. Not ideal, we don't like doing it. It's not what we consider appropriate accommodation. In fact, it's not what the law considers appropriate accommodation in Scotland, but it's better than the alternative. So we get people into hotels, get a roof over their head. We can't claim housing benefit for that, or those people can't claim housing benefit, so the cost falls onto the council. And that is where we are seeing this big increase in cost pressures for us. And it looks... The projection for next year is over 60 million.
Is it 66 million? Is that the...
Yeah, so it's a very big amount of money. So the overall...
What would that mean for ordinary Glaswegians? What would that mean, in terms of an overspend of that nature? Just sort of spell that out. How big about the budget is that? How serious is it?
Well, to put it into context... We were able, for the first time in a while, with our budget at the beginning of this year, to do a big recruitment drive in the city, in a lot of frontline posts where there had been attrition over the years. So in cleansing, in pest control, in parks, in parking attendance, a lot of those frontline posts, we've done a big recruitment drive, and we've employed about. It's about 250 new people that we've employed, or new posts that we've employed, or are in the process of employing. That investment was about £7 million, as I recall. That's off the top of my head, but it's in that ballpark. So if you think about that then multiplied, that's potentially the impact on frontline services, on the people who are delivering frontline services. So it's not sustainable. The entire budget gap is a wee bit bigger than that. It's in the low 90 millions, or the projected budget gap, I should say. This will change. It always changes. Circumstances change. Local government finance moves quite fast, and it's can be hard to keep up with. The rest of that projected 90 odd million is inflationary pressures, which hit us in exactly the same way as they hit households. But by the biggest chunk by far is this homelessness overspend. And we've not been in this position before. Every big city has homelessness and housing pressures. People are drawn to big cities when they find themselves in a personal crisis. Sometimes it seems an instinctive thing to do. I might be more likely to get a home. I might be more likely to get a job. I might be more likely to get support where there's a lot of people, where there are more third sector organisations, for example. So it's a natural instinct. And we would always expect that to happen to a greater or lesser degree. But the degree that we're dealing with now is unprecedented, and it is way beyond what we would ever expect to deal with in the normal way of things in our homelessness services. And it is a pressure that we do not at the moment have the financial bandwidth to be able to absorb at all.
So say that projected 66 million overspend becomes a reality. How many jobs do you think would be at risk? Are we talking hundreds? Are we talking thousands?
I wouldn't want to start putting numbers on it, because there are always ways to find savings. And what I certainly wouldn't want to be suggesting right now that we're suddenly going to make all those people that we employed recently redundant again. And we've got a commitment to no compulsory redundancies. But we would have to find very significant savings. I think it's way too early to say what we would have to look at. But there's no question we would need to look quite deeply right across our services to see where we could find savings. And savings mean inevitably that we are not able to deliver as much as we could previously. The other side of that, of course, is that we might have to put charges up, which we never like having to do as well. But sometimes that's the other way. It's the other way that you can contribute to bringing money in to address a budget gap.
So do you think, without a solution to this, in terms of controlling the costs, maybe a pan-UK solution, we could get higher charges, some job losses, some service cuts? Is that the sort of fear?
It is our fear. It's the potential that we're looking at. We are working very, very hard to find a solution. Can I make that absolutely clear? I don't want to be saying either to Glaswegians generally who rely on our services or to perhaps especially not to the folk, the nearly 30,000 folk who work for Glasgow City Council, that this is definitely going to happen. We are going all out to find solutions to this. We're talking to both governments as much as we possibly can, getting more traction with one than another, I have to say. We are very, very concerned. We are very concerned about this, and we are saying to both governments, this is not sustainable. It is urgent. We need your help. We need you to step in on this. And to the UK government particularly, we're saying you need to change your approach. This policy is failing. It is failing the people who are being made homeless. It's failing refugees who, after all, you have said legally, you're entitled to stay here. We believe that you fled from your home country for a very, very good reason, and you're entitled to stay here legally. But what you're doing then is just walking away and leaving them, and leaving local authorities, not just Glasgow, but I would say we're probably most acutely affected across the UK. But, Manchester will say exactly the same. Birmingham will say exactly the same. Liverpool will say the same. They're all facing these pressures to a greater or lesser degree. And it is because of the way that this policy operates. It is because the UK government has changed one bit of it, but then not changed the rest in order to respond to that, and is just leaving local authorities and local services to cope with that and to absorb that very significant additional pressure that they're putting on us. I want to make it absolutely clear, and I have said this every single time I've been asked to talk about this, for the benefit of, if anyone's in any doubt, this issue is not caused by asylum seekers and refugees. Glasgow has been a dispersal authority, and one of the biggest dispersal authorities in the UK for more than 2 decades now. It brings challenges, but those challenges are far outweighed by the benefits that I believe that it brings, not just to Glasgow, but to Scotland as a whole. Scotland and Glasgow. Scotland is a much more diverse country than it was 20 years ago. That is down to Glasgow. In large part, that is down to Glasgow. Not just the asylum and refugee programme. Also, we have a lot of students come and study here, and when a lot of students who come to Glasgow to study stay here. We've got one of the highest graduate retention rates in the UK as well. But it is in significant degree down to people who have chosen or been forced to come and make Glasgow their home. And I think that's benefited all of us. It's benefited our economy. Glasgow has a rising working age population. That's going against trends in the UK and indeed in Western Europe. That's a good thing. It's to be welcomed. And this has not been caused by people fleeing for their lives from horrendous situations. And also we need to remember that the vast majority of refugees do not come to the UK. The percentage of the UK's population that is refugees is tiny, absolutely tiny. And it's still a tiny percentage of Glasgow's population. I mean, it's in the region of, I think it's only 2 or 3%, something like that. So this is not huge numbers of people actually in the general scheme of things we're talking about. And it is possible to create a policy framework that can turn this into a benefit for the whole of society across these islands. But that policy framework is not there. And right now, the UK government aren't interested in creating it. And our particular issue is in Glasgow that whenever we raise this with them, all they talk about is asylum hotels. And this is not about asylum hotels.
Which you don't have in the city.
We don't have in the city. And actually, we don't have many in Scotland. There are some, but there's not that many. Because actually in the rest of Scotland there aren't a huge number of asylum seekers.
I'll come to the Home Office in a second. You mentioned Glasgow's historic role in terms of dispersal. Does party not think that other councils in Scotland haven't pulled their weight on this? Why is it up to Glasgow to be the compassionate local authority while others don't really seem to pursue the same approach?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I've actually said this before, but yeah, I do think that a wee bit. I would like to see other local authorities step up more. The last UK government changed the rules so that being a dispersal authority was no longer voluntary. So they just started to place asylum seekers in other authorities. And to be fair to other local authorities in Scotland, there are some who absolutely are stepping up, who see the benefits of this. Local authorities which have falling populations and understand that actually inward migration is a good thing to raise your local population. They are stepping up. To be fair to them, it will take a while for Mears, the Home Office contractor, to expand their capacity within those local authorities. I would say that's also an argument, but I have always believed this, for local authorities themselves to be in charge of asylum accommodation. But that's going down a whole other kind of route and complexity, and it's a complex enough area to begin with. Yes, I would like to see the spread of asylum seekers and then subsequently refugees across Scotland more evenly. Glasgow will always be the magnet. And it's right that when someone is given leave to remain, they're then able to go wherever they like in the UK. That is correct. It shouldn't be the case that you say your leave to remain decision's been in Coventry and therefore you're never allowed to leave here. You have to stay here forever. None of the rest of us are subject to those restrictions. We can live where we want. But the chances are, if someone is given leave to remain in somewhere, I don't know, off the top of my head, Dundee, and they make their life in Dundee for a while, they might then choose to stay in Dundee when they get their leave to remain. If they've been an asylum seeker in Dundee, when they get their leave to remain, they might think, well, do you know what? I've lived here for however many months or years. I've got to know the city a bit. I'm actually going to stay here. So there will always be people come to Glasgow and choose to come to Glasgow because there's an existing community here, because there's language support, because the cultural networks are here, because, something as simple as it's much easier to buy halal food. All of those kinds of things will be a draw and will be a magnet. But I do think that if Scotland as a whole is a place that accepts and supports asylum seekers, then Scotland as a whole will also have that wider refugee attraction over time, whereas at the moment 90% of refugees in Scotland live in Glasgow.
I mean, just on the Home Office, you've expressed your unhappiness with their policy changes of late. Now, I think what they've done is they've halved the length of time that someone who's been granted leave to remain can stay in those hotels, and that is kind of fueling this surge in refugee homelessness. What would you like the Home Office to do? What should their response be just now? So
I think first and foremost what we want them to do is to think about this as a whole system, that someone going through the process of being an asylum seeker and then becoming a refugee, it's their responsibility right the way through. At the moment, they're just stopping. It's like, we've given you leave to remain, we've put you out your asylum hotel, you're no longer our responsibility. And the support that they put in place for people at that point is very, very limited. I think they also need to put some money into this. There's just no question. They cannot leave local authorities like Glasgow to just absorb all of this at the expense of our services. It's just not acceptable. And it's not just the impact on refugees themselves. This impacts all of us. It will, in the end, impact everyone. So they do need to put some money into this and essentially almost have funding follow the person. as they go through their journey. I think also they need to, at least as a one-off, support cities to expand as quickly as possible, our housing supply. Now, Scottish Government stepped up to do that. They had an acquisitions fund last year of 80 million, and unusually, and I think absolutely correctly, it didn't go through the usual allocation formula for local authorities. It was targeted at the 5 local authorities that have the biggest pressures, Glasgow being the biggest one. So Glasgow got about more than £11 million out of that. We've been able to use that money to put more homes into our system. So to support housing associations to turn their void homes into livable homes again, and to use compulsory purchase orders to actually buy empty homes or even homes on the market, and just expand our housing supply as quickly as we can. I've asked, I would like the Scottish Government to do that again, and we've explicitly asked them to do that again and to target funding in the same way. Other local authorities will push back against that. I understand that. They're not going to like it. But we are in a housing emergency, and the Scottish Government needs to respond in that way. I think the UK Government also needs to step into that space as well and recognise that they have been the creators of this housing emergency to a very, very significant degree, and they've got a responsibility to help us address it as quickly as possible.
Do you think that Glasgow's taxpayers are going to pick up the tab for a flawed Home Office policy?
We are, and perhaps more relevantly, Glasgow's service users are having to pick up that tab, because the council tax is a tiny part of a very small proportion of our overall budget. The services that we deliver to people are much more than the council tax. So yes, Glasgow's taxpayers, but perhaps even more relevantly, Glasgow's service users. We are all having to pick up this tab. And I think the other thing is, and this has been so frustrating, every time we try and engage with politicians about this in the UK Government, and if our officials are speaking to their officials all the time, that it's not that we don't have contact, there are conversations all the time, but we're not getting meetings, or we get meetings, we've had meetings cancelled at the last minute. There is now a new immigration minister in place. I'll be writing to them very quickly, but the previous immigration minister, Angela Eagle, really just wouldn't meet with us to talk about it. But because the obsession and the focus is so much on asylum hotels just now, that's all we ever get is, we'll move people out of asylum hotels. And you're like, but that's only going to make our situation worse. All you're saying is you're going to make more people homeless more quickly. That doesn't help us. So they're very, very blinkered. They need to look further, they need to open their eyes, they need to open their minds, and they need to think about a policy framework and a funding framework that supports that adequately, that actually is fit for purpose for people who have come to the UK seeking asylum and then being given asylum. And that's the crucial bit. The being given asylum bit, being given leave to remain at the moment is just not on their radar at all. They're not talking about it. They're not thinking about it. They're ignoring it. And that is the bit that's causing us the most challenges, but not only us, as I say, other cities across the UK as well.
Just focus on some of the decisions of the Scottish Parliament as well. I think it's called the abolition of local need. You alluded to it earlier, where someone can be granted leave to remain, say they're in Manchester, but then make an application for temporary accommodation in Glasgow, but they've got no connection to Glasgow. And that, I think, comes about as a result of decisions made by MSPs. How much of a problem is that? Because it seems like a crazy situation and there's no level playing field for councils across the country. So, again, this is a complex situation, and I'm going to have to be a bit pedantic about this because there have been a number of Scottish politicians getting this just wrong. So, the local connections element for what you might call domestic Scottish homelessness legislation, that was abolished relatively recently by MSPs. But that would mean that, say, someone who's become homeless
in South Lanarkshire could come and to Glasgow and declare themselves homeless, and indeed vice versa. Now, ourselves in Edinburgh argued at the time that that would have more of an effect on the more densely populated urban areas. And it has done. And we've argued for a while to the Scottish Government that they need to, again, have the money, recognise where the biggest pressures are, the impact of that local connections, which is right, by the way. It's, as a policy, I'm not opposed to it, but the impact of it isn't, it's not symmetrical across Scotland. It is differential, and ourselves in Edinburgh have particular impact from that. Separately, though, the issue of getting leave to remain and being a refugee and not having a local connection, that long predates. That's different legislation, and it goes way back. And I think actually it is a Scottish Housing Act, but I think it's actually from before devolution. So it's been a long-standing position that leave to remain does not establish a local connection. So there are complexities and I think subtleties in there, but they are important subtleties, because there have been some folk out there claiming this is all the Scottish Government's fault because of local connections. Local connections is a pressure. So local connections in domestic legislation is a pressure, but it is not the main issue. It's a more marginal issue in terms of what we're looking at right now, and what we're facing right now.
Should it be paused, though, while you've got these problems?
We have asked the Scottish Government to consider that. It's not an easy thing. I don't particularly like having to be in that position to ask them to pause or to not enforce what is progressive homelessness legislation, which I support and I believe in. We have asked them to pause it. They're not willing to do that, and I recognise that. I do understand the reasons why. I have said though, and I would say, if you don't want to pause it, if you can't pause it, or bring yourself to pause it, then you need to put the money where it is most needed. Now, I've got to say, the First Minister last week made some really helpful comments where, he can't say in advance, obviously, before it goes to Parliament, and I think it will come from the spending review, but he did make some helpful comments indicating that he recognised that the pressures in Glasgow are particularly significant and that they will try and respond to that, and that that they will target areas of greater need when they're thinking about where housing funding is going. That's very helpful. I really hope, and I will be pushing governments and colleagues in government rather to make sure that does happen. I would say with the Scottish Government, there is a tendency with MSPs. This is not just the government; it's Parliament. There is a tendency sometimes for them to pass legislation which is national in its impact, but actually affects different parts of Scotland differently, and that's not taken into account in the way that the legislation is framed. In some ways, that's understandable. They are thinking on a national level. They're a national parliament. They're legislating for the whole of Scotland, but they need to talk to local government more before they pass that legislation, so that they understand that it's often very, very different, and the funding should reflect that difference.
What was the specific ask that you made of the government in terms of pausing local connections, and when did you make that request?
Well, we've made it a few times. My colleagues in my cabinet who lead on housing and homelessness issues have made this request directly of government in the past. Over the past couple of years, we've been asking it when it became clear that it was a pressure. I think Scottish Government colleagues have made it clear to us they're not willing to do that. They don't want to compromise the integrity of Scotland's progressive housing legislation. I do understand that, and so I suppose we've made a shift perhaps in our request of them, which is more about the funding. Then, if you can't pause it, then you need to fund it.
Are you disappointed that they haven't paused it, given the case that you've made to them?
I understand where they're coming from on it. I understand it was a difficult thing for us to ask as well. Where it is the thing about local government is when you're providing services to people, essential services that people rely on day to day, sometimes you have to be really pragmatic. And in the case of what we were saying to the Scottish Government, we're saying, look, we support this legislation, we absolutely support the principles behind it, but the way that it's actually working in practice is having a differential impact on us.
Is it not an issue about, MSPs passing so-called world-leading legislation, but maybe forgetting about the local partners who have to deliver it on the ground?
Yes, and I think it's a long-standing issue. And it isn't unique to Holyrood. I think this is, and I talk to city leaders globally. One of the great privileges of my job, I talk to city leaders and mayors from all over the world. This is a dynamic that is replicated in just about every country in the world, that national and federal governments make decisions and pass legislation, and then local governments go, hang on a minute, this is going to be quite difficult to make it work. I fully support Scotland's housing legislation. I think it absolutely is. The integrity of that progressive legislation is really important. So I do understand why Scottish Government colleagues didn't want to go down that road. It's not something we're going to continue asking them. We are going to ask them on the funding front instead. I think, though, again, I want to reiterate that particular local connections bit, while it is a pressure for Glasgow, it's not directly connected to this issue of refugee homelessness, and it's considerably more marginal within that overall homelessness impact and homelessness emergency that we're facing within the city just now.
Just a few final points, Susan. You mentioned earlier that you've got this fear that if it's not addressed by the Home Office, that Glaswegians might face job losses, user charges increasing, service cuts. Could it have an impact on council tax? Could you have to increase council tax by a higher level than you might want to?
It's too early to say about any of these things. We don't set our budget till February. We don't know what our settlement is going to be yet. There are other pressures. There are other things that will happen which will bring that projection down. It always happens. The initial projection is horrifying, and then it ends up in a place where it has changed in different ways. Sometimes, there's things that bring it down, other things that push it up, further up. It is way too early to be making any predictions right now about council tax, about service cuts, about jobs, any of those things. What I would say is that we will be going out of our way in Glasgow to keep council tax low. We have consistently tried to keep it as close to 5% as possible, and not go much above that. And even when some councils were going into double figures last year, we didn't do that. It's partly because, in actual fact, council tax isn't enormously helpful in Glasgow because we don't have an awful lot of big hussies in the high bands. So we don't raise proportionally. We don't raise as much through council tax as some other local authorities. We will continue to try to do that. We will continue to try to minimise cuts as much as possible. We will, crucially, talk as much as we possibly can to both governments between now and setting our budget. As I say, I am hopeful. Scottish Government, the First Minister, they have acknowledged the particularly pressured and potentially unsustainable situation that Glasgow's facing. I am glad that they have done that. I would like Glasgow's other government to do the same. In fact, I really need them to do the same, and at the moment they're not. And there's been some really disappointing responses, I think, from some Labour politicians who have just really refused to address it and just tried to throw the blame back. It's just not acceptable. They've also, my biggest concern about all of this, and we're going to debate this in Glasgow City Council tomorrow, is that this situation is exploited, it is misused, and it is abused by the far right and by Reform UK, who I would classify as the far right, to stoke division and fear within our communities, to tell people in Glasgow that some of the challenges that they're facing in their lives are because of asylum seekers and refugees. It is simply not true. It is simply not true. Asylum seekers and refugees are not the cause of a failing economy in the UK that's forcing people into a cost of living crisis, nor are they the cause of a housing emergency in Glasgow. It is a policy that is causing that housing emergency. It's policy decisions. Those can be changed. Those could be changed tomorrow.
How do you feel when Nigel Farage describes Glasgow in disparaging terms as the asylum seeker capital of the UK? Well,
Nigel Farage thinks that's an insult, you see, because Nigel Farage is, he's a racist. There isn't another way to describe it. Glasgow has been one of the the biggest asylum authorities for years and years. This isn't new. We've hosted either at various points either the highest proportion of asylum seekers in comparison to our population, or at some points the highest actual number. I think at the moment we're kind of there or thereabouts, but I think Birmingham has a higher actual number, and certainly some London boroughs have a higher proportion. But this isn't new for us, and for years it's not been a problem. It's something that we have managed. We have been a beacon of integration. A colleague from the Scottish Refugee Council used that term. Glasgow has been a beacon of integration. We've actually been incredibly successful at supporting asylum seekers and then refugees to live in our communities, to become part of our communities, to contribute to our communities and contribute to the city as a whole. It's not a bad thing for us to be hosting asylum seekers. What was particularly disgusting and despicable about what Nigel Farage said is that he said that asylum seekers are more likely to commit crime, that they and more likely to commit crimes against women and children. That is one of the oldest and nastiest racist slurs. It is a centuries-old racist slur that's been used by the worst kind of populists like Nigel Farage for centuries. It is simply false. It is the definition of disinformation. It is designed to instill fear into people, and it is designed to divide our communities, and it is designed, I believe, to actually stir up violence against not just asylum seekers and refugees, but I think any person of colour who lives in our communities in Glasgow.
I mean, you've mentioned the huge financial pressures on Glasgow just now as a result of having to sort of house refugees. Would you be for or against a council tax freeze? In terms of the Scottish Government's next budget?
I would rather they didn't freeze the council tax. On principle, I'd rather they didn't freeze the council tax. I think there was a time when it did serve a purpose, and it did serve a purpose in giving people some surety about at least that household bill. When at a time when everything else, all the other bills were absolutely out of control. I don't think it's helpful for local authorities now. I also believe fundamentally, and I am a local government politician. I fundamentally believe in the democratic principle that local government should get to make its own decisions about these things. And while I understand there are times when it can seem attractive, it wouldn't be my preference. As I say, we in Glasgow, even when there hasn't been a freeze, we have endeavoured to keep council tax rises as low as we can, and we will, I'm certain, continue to try and do that.
One final question that's not related to asylum or immigration. You'll be aware that we ran a lot of stories about the early retirement payoffs, Anne-Marie O'Donnell and some of her colleagues. How did that make you feel? Because it just seemed incredible that people like that could retire on such a huge sum of money, given the pressures that Glasgow's facing. I'm
very angry about it. I'm still very angry about it. I was misled. I wasn't told about it because the very small number of individuals involved knew that I wouldn't have approved it, that I wouldn't have signed it off. There was a time in Glasgow City Council when senior politicians did sign off these kinds of payments, but I think they knew that we would not have done that, and so it was done covertly. It was not. The information was not shared with senior politicians. It absolutely should have been. It was kept from us. That information was withheld. I think that's completely unacceptable. And I'm angry, and honestly, at the time I was a bit upset because I think I was personally misled and personally lied to about it, or certainly about the situation round about it. So yeah, I'm very glad. I think the response that the new chief executive put in place at the request of myself and my deputy, who's the city treasurer, and it was my deputy councillor Ricky Bell, who saw it in the accounts and who kind of raised the alarm, if you like. And he and I immediately went to the new chief executive, and I have to say her response has been, I think, superb. I think a lot of her and her colleagues are very angry about it as well, that they've been put in a position where perhaps folk out there think that's the kind of thing that they would do too. But she has certainly taken steps to make sure that it won't happen again. We have retrieved some of that money. I'm very glad to say. We continue to believe that all of the individuals involved should pay back.
Really? You would like everyone to pay
Yes,
back?
I think it would be the right thing to do. I'm not necessarily expecting them to do so, but I think they should at the very least look to their consciences and consider following in the footsteps of the former chief executive who did, I think, look to her conscience and decide to pay it back. None of them had less than comfortable pensions to begin with. They were all senior officers. They don't need this extra. But I can't make them, and certainly all of the reporting and all of the investigation into it that we carried out has made it clear that there's certainly, on those other individuals, there is no illegality in that sense. So it's not something we could force them to do. But I do think they should consider doing the right thing.
Susan Aitken, thanks for joining us on Planet Holyrood. You
very
can listen
welcome.
to this episode of the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or you can watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
Thank you.
That's us.